I think the military still use their old bases. I don't know what for. But they're hiding something. And I hope I never find out what. For a while, I was just a police officer in a sleep little village. The village itself wasn't creepy at all. I knew everyone, they knew me. Life was simple, and as I was coming up to 30, I had a house, and whilst I was single, I enjoyed the company of a few colleagues, and occasional visits from school friends. I was happy with my lot in life. I work in Corsham, in the southwest of the UK. Corsham really doesn't have much going for it. There's a new military base a mile or so out, and that's about it. Occasionally, we'll be assigned to patrol the roads around the new military base. Not so much to arrest people breaking in, but more to stop people parking around, or to stop people fly tipping. Not the most interesting job. But yesterday, I was assigned to the old base. I thought it was funny at the time. The base had been out of action for 30 or so years. A huge, monolithic structure that was made out of drab concrete. It wasn't being used for anything, and it just stood there in the countryside, empty. I was assigned to sit in a small booth outside the main gate and guard it all night. It didn't seem too hard. In fact, it seemed pretty easy. The shift was 10 until 5 the next morning. And so, in the day, I had time to do a little research. A quick Google search shows that the base was shut down sometime in the 80s. Further research showed that it was built as a type of nuclear bunker. It was designed to house a huge underground city. It was a labyrinth, with a main control room, then hundreds of smaller corridors running off to create a living environment. I was convinced that I was working there to prevent people breaking in. Free parties, if you don't know, are a phenomenon in the UK whereby younger teenagers take as many drugs as possible, find an abandoned warehouse, and play music until the early hours. There was a huge free party scene in the southwest, and I assumed I was preventing people from breaking in and taking as many narcotics as they could funnel up their noses. It seemed logical at the time. I was to prevent anyone from abusing government property, but there was something off about my job. It could be done by regular patrols, and the offer was disclosed with a confidential stamp. I was only to discuss the job with members of the police force. I was to work there for 5 days, in a tiny booth, just outside the large metal doors that led down a ramp into the main room, or I assumed so from the outside structure of the place. The doors were safety programmed, made so that they could be unlocked from both the inside and the outside, to prevent builders while constructing the complex from getting locked inside. The booth was just big enough for me, my laptop and some books. I had glass windows that would gradually fog up as I watched the roads ahead. Every couple of hours or so, I was to walk on patrol around the grounds. The first night was fine. I simply stayed awake, smoked, and watched downloaded movies on my laptop. It rained, and the relaxing pitter-patter sent me into a trance. It didn't seem strange at the time, but now I think about it, the sound of the rain masked something else, though I couldn't tell you what. The second night was when it started to get weird. Silence covered the base like a thick blanket, almost muffling any noise I would make, except from inside the base came an irregular series of tapping noises. I assumed that they were simply rainwater dripping, but there was something organic about them. They would slowly grow in volume. The only sound for miles was an almost desperate tapping. The noise began to bug me, and so I began my patrol. The flashlight showed nothing but the fences, and when I put my hand to the concrete, it was dry. The moisture slowly went from my mouth. That meant no rainwater could be dripping. I finished my shift and drove home, checking my wing mirror the whole way. The third night, the tapping stopped until about midnight. Then came a gentle scraping noise, the sound of nails against concrete. It wasn't just at the gate, but instead it would move around inside the complex. I lit a cigarette and began my patrol again, determined to find the source. However, as I walked around the edge, following the wire fence, the noise followed me. The scraping wouldn't go any quieter, and when I stopped to stub out my cigarette, it scratched in the same place. It was as if something was inside, and through delusion was trying to burrow through the concrete. For me. The fourth night, I turned up early, when it was still light, and patrolled the grounds. Nothing was there, except for the faint smell of rotting fish, a wet, damp smell that lingered just above the ground. It began to get dark, and the scraping continued. This time, more frenzied. I hadn't told anyone about it before, hoping that it was an animal trapped, or a machine deep inside still working. I called a friend of mine, who was on patrol nearby, and asked him if they could swing by. I think the fear was evident in my voice, as they turned up as fast as they could. When they appeared, the scratching ceased. They patrolled with me, and assumed that I was going a bit nuts, penned in a small box for 7 hours in the dark. Laughing, they left me alone again. The scratching returned as soon as they left, but faster. Much faster. This time there was a determination to it, a desire to be heard. It was almost as if something was playing a sick game with me. I'd locked the door of the booth and must have smoked about 40 cigarettes, clouding the small room with smoke. Whatever was inside there was taunting me. For some reason, it was trying to target me. I didn't sleep that night, and barely in the day. I was kept awake, sat in my apartment with an ear to the wall, terrified of the incessant scratching. I almost called in sick on the 5th night, but decided to return. Again, as soon as it got dark, the scratching came. If you have a desk nearby, start scratching it as fast as possible. Imagine that noise, but echoing through a huge, empty concrete bunker, and you'll understand why the very noise made me shake. That noise, that horrid noise, felt like it was scratching at the inside of my skull. The scratching stopped at 1 in the morning. It fell silent, and I had to push my face against a window to see whether the gates were open. They were tight shut from what I could see. I felt I could hear my own breath, getting louder and louder. It almost echoed. In fact, I was convinced it did. And when I leant back into my chair, the windows were steamed up. I used the cuff of my sleeve to rub the steam off, but it didn't work. Puzzled, I tried again, rapidly rubbing my sleeve to clear any moisture from the window. Again, the steam stayed. My heart skipped a beat. The steam wasn't from inside the booth. Something had been looking in, right at me. Something had left its breath condensed against my booth. Terrified, I inhaled and realised I'd been holding my breath. I had been holding my breath. That meant the deep, heavy breathing I'd heard echoing around the complex wasn't mine. Something was out there. It was 1:30 when I left, locking the main gate, packing my bags and running for my car, heart pumping in my chest. Half-heartedly, I convinced myself I'd been hearing myself breathe. and that the mist on the window was merely a coincidence. I'd almost convinced myself, but something wasn't right with the story in my head. In fact, something was very, very wrong. I arrived home safely, bursting into my house and turning on every light I could find. There was this niggling thought that something was wrong, still playing with, and although I lay in bed, I couldn't quite work out what it was. When I figured it out, I sat bolt upright and screamed. I screamed and I screamed, shaking with spittle flying from my lips. I'd locked the gate, except I'd never had to do that before, because the gate was always locked. Whatever was in there had escaped. I stayed up all the next day, drinking coffee, watching TV without absorbing any of what was happening on the screen. I became paranoid, turning the volume off on the TV and simply listening. Even the sound of cars driving past set me on edge. I called my boss and told him I couldn't work there anymore. He didn't sound surprised at all, and instead told me patrols would be taken over by someone else. A tone haunted his voice. It wasn't quite fear, but the quick breaths in between his words suggested something was up, or I was paranoid. I've never really had faith in my own judgment, an odd quality for a police officer, but I'm usually able to convince myself that I've simply misunderstood. As I hung up and put the phone down next to me, the sun began to set. As darkness crept over, I closed all the blinds and sat on the sofa, staring at the white noise on the television. It was faint, almost inaudible to the untrained ear. A small scratching coming from outside the walls of my house. I bit my lip, closed my eyes, and listened as it gradually moved. Slowly, the scratching would slide from wall to wall, as if trying to find a way in. I haven't slept yet. I don't think I will.